Very distinguished guests all. I'm delighted to be here this evening. In my time, I have visited and worked closely with many Crown jurisdictions across the world, overseas territories, and of course the 16 Commonwealth realms, including the United Kingdom. I regret, however, that this is the first occasion in which I have managed to make it to Gibraltar, but I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. And thank you so much for the warmth of the welcome that's been extended to me by everyone. It's my enormous privilege to be delivering this inaugural Chancellor's lecture at the University of Gibraltar this evening. I'm very grateful to Lord Luce, the Chancellor. I'm slightly embarrassed to think that it was his privilege that I should have been serving with him in the royal household. I think quite the opposite was the case, but I'm delighted also that he felt willing to extend this invitation. Of course, to Professor Catherine Back-Leader, whom I'm delighted is now confirmed as Vice-Chancellor, and not least to all those in the university team who've made me and my wife Emma so warmly welcome. From my own vantage point of chairing a university council for a few years, it goes without saying how quickly I have come to appreciate more than ever the place of higher education in equipping students for wherever their careers may take them, a deep respect for the role of academic research, and, which I think is so relevant here in Gibraltar, the importance of being rooted in one's own jurisdiction. I've therefore learnt with admiration of the vision and commitment it's taken to establish the University of Gibraltar, a brand new contemporary public university with its own very clear commitment to teaching, research, and community. Gibraltar itself, of course, is a leading example of a jurisdiction with the appetite responsibly to diversify its economy and redefine its relations with a wider global community. Already its achievements in the financial and tourism sectors, for example, are remarkable. So the recent establishment of this university, what the Vice-Chancellor told me this morning I'm allowed to describe as a startup, is itself a testament to Gibraltar's ambitions in underpinning that activity, with a key role in securing its future economic, social, and sustainable development. My theme this evening is Crown and Commonwealth. In its way, as the Chancellor has suggested, really part of the deep fabric of Gibraltar. And although I am advertised as the Queen's former private secretary, I do not, of course, claim to be speaking in any formal capacity. Indeed, I stood down from my former role more than a year ago after 15 very rewarding years with the royal household. It was not a role I had ever planned for or aspired to. My earlier career, as Lord Luce has noted, had been in very different orbits, but it was an enormously stimulating challenge and, of course, a great privilege to have been engaged with the institution of monarchy at close quarters. All I can do now is to offer you a few observations from the comfort of my royal afterlife. Despite being very much yesterday's man, I would like to briefly consider the role itself of the private secretary. This is not because it can claim an exaggerated importance in national life, by the way. As a predecessor of mine once put it, the clue to the position and its necessary low profile is in the title, private secretary. It is, after all, only the good judgment of the sovereign herself that really matters in our part of the constitutional settlement, and we have been especially well served in that respect in living memory. Instead, I will just discuss the evolution of the post only for what it says about the development of a modern constitutional monarchy. Until the early 19th century, the Home Secretary was generally responsible for most of the tasks that these days fall to the private secretary, including the role of constitutional advisor. Queen Victoria struggled without a private secretary for the first years of her reign, relying instead on her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, to fulfil the task. He even had an office at Buckingham Palace. At this distance, it seems quite remarkable that he could manage the burden of those additional duties in looking after the Queen that he added to running a country and a government. But I expect the arrangement was in part an exercise in moderating any tendency towards independence in the new Queen. The arrival of Prince Albert at Queen Victoria's side in 1840 marked a major change. The Prime Minister was turfed out of his nice office in Buckingham Palace, and Prince Albert became in effect Queen Victoria's private secretary, confirming the place of monarchy above political party. He, Prince Albert, helped fashion a modern system of administration that ensured that the sovereign should always be informed of governmental policy. Articulated in the writings of Walter Bagehot, the constitutional writer, the modern system of constitutional monarchy was essentially established. And with it, the role of the private secretary evolved into what is recognised today: independent of the Prime Minister, working for the sovereign and for no one else. The death of Prince Albert in 1861, and I won't exaggerate this historical parade, by the way, and Queen Victoria's consequent retreat from public life, placed the institution in some peril, even at a time of high prosperity and ambition for Britain and then its empire. Public resentment grew of the invisible Queen. Queen Victoria was criticised for being both invisible and, alas, doing almost no work. The same Walter Bagehot warned that Victoria was actually damaging the monarchy. He said, "To be invisible is to be forgotten. To be a symbol and an effective symbol, you must be visibly and often seen." Anyone who has watched the film Mrs. Brown with Judi Dench and Billy Connolly will know that eventually Queen Victoria heeded his advice. Her return to public life for the final quarter of a century of her reign was itself hugely successful. The principle that the sovereign should see and be seen by his or her people was now firmly established. If the Crown was to succeed in discharging its responsibilities, the King or Queen needed to be very visible. In the modern era, that visibility depended not just on sober reporting in the court circular and other newspaper columns. Increasingly, it demanded engagement with other media. And in the Queen's reign, this Queen's reign, especially with television. Indeed, the Queen's coronation in 1953 itself could be said to have ushered in the mass television era in the United Kingdom. While we're on the subject of television, I am not very well equipped to discuss the Netflix series, The Crown. True, the dramatisation has been a global success, and there is, I believe, still an ambition for it to run on for 6 series. Its appeal has been that it's based on a real person. But beyond that single proposition, many of the plot lines are fanciful and some of them complete fabrication. So at the risk of disappointment to this audience, my analysis will stick to the real thing instead. One of the Crown's best understood roles is providing stability and continuity in times of change. Now, I know that the Chancellor has just noted that the purpose of this lecture is not to be drawn into too much of the contemporary political discussion, but I will just make 1 or 2 reflections, if I may. We tell ourselves, of course, that this is a time of relative uncertainty. The pages of the venerable Gibraltar Chronicle and other media attest to tomorrow's European elections, the latest stage in our European political drama. I regret that even as a recently created parliamentarian, I cannot give you an authoritative reading from the crystal ball of British politics about where our relationship with the European Union will finally settle. Indeed, although I will not dwell on Brexit now, I think it's impossible equally to ignore it altogether. So I do have one or two core beliefs on the subject. First, the United Kingdom's affections and deep respect for our European neighbourhood are very strong. Despite the distraction of having to redefine the precise political relationship among ourselves, I believe these fundamental sentiments will survive. We will have sorely tried each other, we will certainly have disagreed, and we may even have despaired of ever settling our differences. But the familial bonds within Europe are far more than, and some would say quite distinct from, politics alone. Secondly, although the internal political debates have sometimes descended into a rather unedifying mess, I believe that the time will come when the discussion returns to less fractious, more pragmatically British accommodation. A former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, Lord Judge, Igor Judge, recently described the problem. He said, and I quote, "Adherence to your beliefs and principles is not absolutist. Principles matter. I'm not decrying them. What is absolutist is when you are so preoccupied with your own beliefs that you no longer allow for the possibility that there may be another sensible, even if misguided view opposite to your own. And simultaneously, while blind to that possibility, you truly believe that you are the only person being reasonable." Of the Brexit debate, Lord Judge concluded that there has been too much absolutism and insufficient moderation. There are many like me, inside and without Parliament, who believe that in spite of the current rather provocative milieu, we can relearn something of our former ability to respect views that we do not share. The unhappinesses of the Brexit debate have not, in my view, permanently erased our national characteristics, although many feel bruised. Instead, I'll take comfort from the hope that these traits of pragmatism and moderation will one day re-emerge in the public debate. So I freely admit that I've strayed from my theme. What, one may ask, links the uncertainty of our daily politics and our place within our own European neighbourhood to our constitutional settlement? Well, I will not surprise you by suggesting that in our system, the institution of monarchy is one such cornerstone of confidence and moderation in a very shaky polity. That is why when the Queen's reputation for impartiality was questioned in the British media in the lead up to the referendum in 2016, the Sun newspaper ran the headline, "Queen backs Brexit." It was necessary to challenge it successfully with the regulator. I believe the Crown should be unapologetic about the importance attaching to its role in providing impartial stability and continuity. Before the vocabulary was hijacked by the Irish border question, we might even have described the monarchy as a backstop. We might now prefer the cricketing metaphor of a constitutional long stop instead. In fact, my analysis continues with all of us, and for this reason, whatever attitudes exist towards the Crown, whether as an institution with a role to play in our constitutional, political and national lives, or as individual members of a royal family, it's highly unusual to find people with absolutely no view at all. This is especially true in those jurisdictions where the Queen is sovereign, and to a large extent among the other members of the Commonwealth. Partly, we simply can't escape it. For example, the Queen looks back at us from Gibraltar's currency and postage stamps, and royal events have a habit of catching our eye. Recent weddings and babies spring to mind. There's a standard list of functions that describes the Queen's role. These include performing the ceremonial and official duties of a head of state, including representing the United Kingdom to the rest of the world, providing a focus for national identity and unity, providing stability and continuity in times of change, recognising achievement and excellence, for example, through the honours system, and encouragement of public and voluntary service. Many of the Crown's activities cannot, though, easily be bundled into a single category or another. A royal visit, say, to another country may involve a number of these roles. Domestically, the royal family blends a familiar cycle of events, many of a national character, with more local and less prescribed activities. The Queen's role as head of nation, actively supported by her family, has been proclaimed through this same determination to be visible. It's involved relentless engagement with individuals and groups in the United Kingdom and around the world, in the Queen's case, for over 67 years, sharing in the celebrations, achievements, and sorrows of people everywhere. Inevitably, the accessibility of the institution has involved self-sacrifice, including the abandonment of rights and freedoms which the rest of us take for granted, perhaps privacy foremost amongst them. The contemporary monarchy, personified by the royal family, has taken a place in the sitting rooms of the nation, strengthening its status as a yardstick in the national conversation, by which, just briefly, we might measure our own lives. The numbers of people touched in this way, amplified through modern media, are quite literally countless. These days, the work goes on actively across 3 generations, led by the Queen, the Prince of Wales, and Prince William. It's probably too early to be talking of 4 generations at work. Poor Prince George is only 5 and is preoccupied with more important things like childhood. But even onto him may one day be projected the hopes and fears of his own era. Throughout her reign, the Queen, as head of nation, has brought witness and compassion at times of great national suffering and loss. Whether following the Aberfan disaster of 1967, when a coal-tip landslide killed 144, the majority being pupils at Pantglas Junior School, or the Dunblane School massacre in 1996, or the London 7/7 bombings in 2005, or most recently, I suppose, the Grenfell Tower disaster in 2017. These and others were the occasions on which, in the words of the constitutional historian Vernon Bogdanor, the Queen was able to interpret the nation to itself. This has been not only a remarkable personal attribute of the Queen herself, but also perhaps a function of the very deep roots of the institution in the national psyche. Formally, the highest expression of the Queen's place in national and international life is captured in her role as head of state. She is a symbol of the unity of the United Kingdom and its various territories, including Gibraltar, and represents, some will say she is, the sovereignty of the country, with all that that entails, including the guardianship of the constitutional settlement. In this model of the constitutional head of state, the Queen discharges essentially formal representational functions, while the substantive government of state is in the hands of government. We can say that to a greater or lesser extent, the Crown is therefore acting on the advice of the Crown's ministers, even if it is not bound to accept that advice. irrespective of the state of the Queen's prerogative powers, most of which can be said to have been circumscribed in recent times, I nevertheless subscribe to the body of opinion that respects the high authority of the Crown in our Constitution, precisely because the Queen tends not to exercise it except on the advice of her government. There is something constitutionally significant, I believe, about keeping one's powder dry. Arguments rage whether one form of government is in all or most respects superior to another. Elsewhere, times have changed for a head of state in other systems. Until relatively recently, the inviolability of a head of state was held to be almost sacred, for example. Then came the trials of a succession of presidents and former presidents who, having assumed and abused widely drawn powers, had been challenged by international justice. I'm prejudiced, of course, but I'm familiar with the head of state variant which, under the British Crown, can be said to work efficiently and aspire to the highest standards of human behaviour. Taking that point further, reputation can often be the very substance and purpose of exchanges between heads of state, both personally and on behalf of their nations, through a process of credibility by visible association. So is reconciliation, building trust and increasing effect in a relationship. Perhaps the most prominent example of a head of state's effect in this respect during the Queen's reign came after her state visit to the Republic of Ireland in 2011, which I'll just reflect on for a moment. The preoccupations of Gibraltar's single land border with a neighbour are, of course, shared in the United Kingdom also. During the previous visit by a British monarch to Dublin, King George V in 1911, there had not even been a border to cross. Ireland has been as much a part of the United Kingdom then as England. In the years since, ancient bitternesses had given rise to bloody sectarian conflict and deep political mistrust. In that 100 years, the island of Ireland had seen partition, separation, independence, and what one author has described as a chaotic, tempestuous, often bloody love-hate relationship. The symbolism of the Crown in this relationship between North and South had, rightly or wrongly, itself hardened. To one side, the individual who was wearing the crown became the emblem of sufferings and injustices. To the other, the sentiments of defiant unionists were vested in the Queen both as a person and as an idea. Neither, of course, did Gibraltar escape the shadow of that conflict. A plot to bomb a changing of the guard ceremony at the convent resulted in the deaths of 3 members of the Provisional IRA here on the 6th of March 1988. The Queen had her own deeply personal associations with the conflict too. Throughout the Troubles there had been often very credible threats to her life. Bomb scares were common. Most painfully, the Duke of Edinburgh's uncle, Earl Mountbatten of Burma, together with members of his family, had been murdered by the IRA during a holiday in Ireland in 1979. Relations between the two countries had been so estranged that no British monarch had set foot in Dublin for 100 years. At a state dinner in Dublin Castle, formerly the seat of English rule in Ireland since King Henry II in 1127, the Queen addressed the Irish nation. The Queen's speech changed the tenor of Anglo-Irish relations, perhaps forever, liberating two nations from centuries of rancour and misunderstanding. She had begun with words in the Gaelic language, carefully delivered, to the utter astonishment of President McAleese, who was sitting beside her. But it was her later words and the sentiments behind them that made the greatest impact. To all those who have suffered as a consequence of our troubled past, she said, I extend my sincere thoughts and deep sympathy. With the benefit of historical hindsight, we can see things which we would have done differently or not at all. As a worked example of the effect of the Crown in cementing relations with a neighbour, the Queen's visit to Ireland was probably without parallel. As said, the Crown is a defining feature in our country's appreciation of itself. Many of those common attributes are clearly felt and appreciated here. But neither are they bound within our own borders, because a proudly self-governing Gibraltar also sits within the extraordinary family that is the Commonwealth. That relationship has some obvious manifestations, such as Gibraltar having sent athletes to every Commonwealth Games since 1958. The so-called friendly games have always been as much an opportunity to meet as to compete. Speaking of sport, and on a personal note, as someone from the Western Isles of Scotland, I am glad to salute Gibraltar for hosting the next round of the International Island Games in July. Having seen the efforts being made not a stone's throw from here to prepare the facilities in time, there is no doubting Gibraltar's commitment to what promises to be its own fantastic international festival of sport. The Western Isles team is in an advanced state of preparation and will, I am sure, enjoy every minute. As I'm thinking about it, I suppose there's a shortage of international festivals called the International Rock Games. So I think Gibraltar has done very well indeed to capture this one for island states everywhere. Another and very interesting and important Commonwealth development is the University of Gibraltar gaining educational affiliate membership of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. This entrenches, I think, the enlightened decision of the university to offer its first Commonwealth scholarship in support of PhD study by Commonwealth students. The association, the ACU, is, of course, the world's oldest international network of universities with a mission to promote and support excellence in higher education for the benefit of individuals and societies throughout the Commonwealth and beyond. Alongside that long history, the ACU also represents the future, with over 500 member universities in 50 Commonwealth countries. I know, as the Chancellor knows, that the association under its present leadership is highly ambitious for this amazing network, and recently appointed the Duchess of Sussex as its patron, precisely to help drive forward its mission with an even higher profile. The ACU has embraced Gibraltar's own ambitions with alacrity. Indeed, the timing of the University of Gibraltar's establishment could not have been more fortuitous in this particular Commonwealth context. Among commentators and critics, there has been a tendency in the past to question the point of the Commonwealth. The answers can be long and varied, but for these purposes, I can do no better than repeat a formulation by Sir Peter Marshall, a former distinguished diplomat and Deputy Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, quoted in a recent book by Rt Hon and the Queen of the World. Sir Peter says, "I have lost count of the number of times I have heard the Commonwealth's demise confidently predicted or stridently recommended." Explaining that the Commonwealth is many things at once, he continues that the experts debate whether the Commonwealth is a church, a club, or a beehive. The only possible diplomatic answer is that it is all three, simultaneously and interactively. I myself have experienced the Commonwealth of politics and high summitry, exemplified in the series of Commonwealth heads of government meetings. In that sense, the Commonwealth is a vitally important forum, but not necessarily a highly efficient diplomatic instrument. After all, its membership is a very diverse group of countries. It's easy to overlook the importance which those countries place in their membership of the Commonwealth in the first place. There is, of course, uneven adherence in some of its jurisdictions to the values held very dear by others. Nonetheless, Commonwealth countries in Africa, for example, have generally demonstrated far higher standards of democracy and the rule of law than in their non-Commonwealth neighbours. There is heroic work going on within the Commonwealth apparatus to improve the lot of its citizens and, increasingly, to give voice to its smaller states. Moreover, the end of apartheid, white majority rule, in South Africa remains a testament to the more than 30 years of continuous effort by the Commonwealth. One of my happiest Commonwealth memories was attending the Queen's dinner at a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting some years ago. I was sat at one of many tables where the Prime Minister of a leading industrial nation was locked in conversation with the President of a small island state, whose very existence was threatened by even a small rise in sea levels. Afterwards, the President of the small island state told me that he had never had the opportunity to confront the Prime Minister of a major carbon dioxide emitting state on equal terms. It was, he said, only because of the Queen's invitation that he could ask this Prime Minister what he was going to do to stop his own country from sinking beneath the waves. Given the academic effort which this university is devoting to the marine environment and climate change, it's fair to say that Gibraltar itself is in common cause with an Indian Ocean island or a distant Pacific atoll. Indeed, this area of academic concentration already promises to be one of the university's crown jewels. So the Commonwealth can be and mean many things to many people. But without doubt, it is an enormous opportunity. In business, for example, the prospects for intra-Commonwealth trade, irrespective of Brexit, to which the Commonwealth is most definitely not trying to be an alternative, draws on what has been widely described as the Commonwealth Advantage. A deal between two Commonwealth nations is said to cost nearly 20% less than the equivalent deal between non-Commonwealth nations. And why? Because, of course, of a shared language, a common legal system, and long-established business practices. Above all else, I share the view that the Commonwealth is, in fact, destined to become the mother of all networks among its people. Its interconnectivity, drawing on its common attributes, is second to none. The Commonwealth has emerged in the digital age in a way which is organic, woven together, not so much by governmental linkages, but by people. It's a network which is by far the largest and most extensive on the planet, and which is especially vigorous among the Commonwealth's younger population. More than 60% of its 2.4 billion inhabitants is aged 29 or under. A Commonwealth group which enjoys the highest penetration of digital technology of all kinds. So when we next ask ourselves about the Commonwealth in the digital age, we can point to how its modern structure and character happen to fit remarkably well with the new template that rapid technological advance and popular empowerment are imposing on our times. So what does the Commonwealth Advantage mean for Gibraltar? Bluntly, for a jurisdiction which I was told this morning likes to embrace the big ideas, access to a third of the world's population on common terms is a pretty good start. I'd like to leave you with a short story. Not so long ago, the Governor-General of Solomon Islands wrote to me when I was at Buckingham Palace. Back in the mid-1970s, he had been an eager young lawyer, the first Solomon Islander, by the way, ever to graduate in law. And he had been sent around his country canvassing opinion about the kind of country that Solomon Islands might become upon independence. Overwhelmingly and enthusiastically, they chose to become a constitutional monarchy under our present Queen as a focal point and unifying force in that country. Independence was declared in 1978, and Her Majesty was duly written into the Constitution. Nearly 35 years later, the Queen's realms were considering legislation that would allow a firstborn daughter to succeed to the throne as of right. That reform, which subsequently became the succession to the Crown Act, did not of itself appear particularly controversial. Unfortunately, it presented a problem for Solomon Islands. In his letter to me, the now Governor-General explained that when the Constitution for Solomon Islands had been drawn up, it had included absolutely no detailed provision for succession. No one, the Governor-General wrote, had ever stopped to imagine that the Queen wouldn't live forever. Well, Her Majesty continues to serve us all. A few weeks ago, the Queen turned 93, having been Queen for no fewer than 67 years. In 1947, on her 21st birthday, the Queen had addressed all the peoples of the Commonwealth, wherever they live, whatever race they come from, and whatever language they speak, she said. Addressing them directly, she continued, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service." There can be little doubt that Her Majesty has fulfilled that pledge through a lifetime's devotion to thinking about, talking to, and travelling among the people of the Commonwealth. That commitment is shared by her family, and especially, as noted by Lord Luce, by the Prince of Wales, who, with the agreement of Commonwealth leaders last year, one day will succeed the Queen as head of the Commonwealth. He recently described the Commonwealth as vital to the health of the world and the future of humanity, noting that it had been the cornerstone of his own life. As the Queen has said herself, the Commonwealth is in many ways the face of the future. And in looking ahead to what I hope will be many distant years, for the Commonwealth and for Gibraltar, that would be a very just legacy. Thank you very much.